My name is Greg Waldron. I am the Asian Managing Editor of FlightGlobal. Today I have the privilege of moderating the second in a series of 4 FlightGlobal webinars produced in association with the Singapore Air Show and focusing on themes that will be big talking points in the run-up and during next February's show. For this webinar, we are delighted to welcome the Boeing Company as sponsor. Southeast Asia is a region of great strategic importance. It is characterized by critical choke points, such as the Straits of Malacca, and contested maritime regions, such as the South China Sea. This vast area faces significant geopolitical challenges, periodic natural disasters, and some countries face very real internal security issues. Southeast Asia has also been hard hit by COVID-19. In addition to its public health impact, the pandemic will strain government finances, and this will impact defense spending. Nonetheless, the Singapore Air Show will remain the premier venue for the global aerospace industry to meet with government and military officials from around the region. Southeast Asia has nearly limitless requirements for air power updates, including fighters, helicopters, and aircraft that can support missions such as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as anti-submarine warfare and maritime patrol. Several countries in the region also place a high priority in using defense acquisitions to help them develop indigenous aerospace capabilities. To explore these topics, I'm joined by an eminent panel that offers unique perspectives on Southeast Asia's air power, opportunities, and challenges. Our panel features 2 influential analysts, a consultant with rich experience in the region, and a senior business development executive with a major aerospace company. But before I introduce them, a reminder that we are live for the next hour, and there is an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists throughout the session. Using the Q&A icon, use the Q&A icon, and we will try to get through as many as possible during the time that we have. So, on to our guests. First, from our sponsor, Boeing, Sean Liebman serves as Director of Global Sales and Marketing for Mobility and Surveillance Aircraft. Prior to joining Boeing in 2017, he served as a naval flight officer in the U.S. Navy, flying the P-3C and P-8A maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. He retired as a Navy captain after 25 years of service. Second, I would like to welcome Dr. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Among other areas, Malcolm is an expert on future warfare and military technology, as well as China's military modernization. Our next panelist is Dr. Wu Shang-Su, research fellow at Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. His research areas include defense issues in Southeast Asia and Taiwan. And the final panelist is Ray Corrigan, who does consulting work for international defense firms. A veteran of the US Navy, Ray was formerly Raytheon's country manager in Singapore. So to kick things off, I'd like to pose a question to Sean. Sean, Southeast Asia has pressing needs for various military aircraft. From Boeing's perspective, what are the region's key air power requirements over the coming decade?
Yeah, good afternoon, Greg, and thank you for this opportunity. I'll start by saying that there are 2 geographical characteristics that distinguish Southeast Asia from other regions of the globe, such as perhaps the Middle East or Europe. The first is the vast distances within the region. You know, as an example, it's 2,000 miles from Darwin to Manila, or 1,500 miles from Manila to Kuala Lumpur. And of course, Indonesia spans more than 3,000 miles from its eastern to its western boundaries. And the second geographical characteristic is that the volume of the maritime domain vastly exceeds the volume of the land domain, leading to expansive maritime security requirements, particularly in light of the importance of maritime trade within the region. So those 2 geographical characteristics lead to 4 high-level requirements or attributes for military aircraft in the region: range, speed, persistence, and multi-mission capability. In light of the vast distances in the region, the importance of the attribute of range or radius is self-explanatory. It's also important to keep in mind that aerial refueling can extend the organic mission radius of a platform. And that's why we see so many Southeast Asian countries interested in investing in platforms that are capable of in-flight refueling and also platforms that can deliver aerial refueling. The attribute of speed also brings tremendous advantages given the distances in the region. Combination of long range and high speed extends the strategic surveillance horizon for patrol, reconnaissance, and early warning aircraft, enabling earlier detections of air, maritime, and undersea threats, which enables more time for decision makers to deal with those approaching threats. Once an aircraft is transited to its operating station, the attribute of persistence extends the window of time to deliver its effects, whether those effects are surveillance, offensive or defensive counter air, or precision strike. And more persistence equates to fewer platforms to deliver continuous coverage, especially at long ranges. And then the final attribute that I mentioned was multi-mission capability. Given the multi-domain threat environment in the region, with both air, land, maritime, and undersea threats, and, oh, by the way, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the pressures on defense spending, given economic recovery from COVID, it only makes sense to acquire platforms that have multi-mission capability to maximize capability for the investment. And so as an example, fighter bomber aircraft should have maritime strike capability in addition to anti-air capability or land attack capability. And ISR platforms should have overland, maritime, and undersea ISR capability, again, to maximize the capability per unit of investment.
It's really interesting, Sean. So some good observations about the flexibility and the multiple capabilities that people need, especially given the geography here. Malcolm, what's your perspective on what we see in air power in the region in the coming 10 years? I think you're muted, Malcolm. There you go. Okay.
Look, I think Southeast Asian states have two primary risks that they face. The first is posed by a rising China that clearly challenges their security interests in the South China Sea and beyond. The second is the potential risk posed by internal unrest and insurgency and terrorism threats, the sort of thing we saw in the Philippines and elsewhere. So the question for Southeast Asian air forces is, how do they balance those two very different threats? I think that the China challenge of a rising China that will seek to assert itself in the region is the overwhelming threat that they face, and they have to respond to that primarily. That is going to require a change in their mindset and their thinking and their culture from what they've had in the past, where they're predominantly focused on that internal counterinsurgency threat in the region. So they need to start thinking about the sorts of capabilities that they should acquire that they can't match China plane for plane, missile for missile, but they need to think about asymmetric capabilities that can deter a rising China that is prepared to be assertive, particularly in challenging states like Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia over South China Sea claims. So they've also got a challenge in the sense that they can't afford to have large force structures. They can't afford to have large investment in capability. So where do they balance their investment? Do they balance it in favor of platforms and acquiring the latest platforms in terms of 4.5 generation and 5th generation systems? Or do they invest in sustainment of capabilities so that whatever they acquire is operationally useful and ready? And I think that this is an area where Southeast Asian air forces have really failed in the past in terms of maintaining the operational readiness of existing platforms. Part of the reason, I think, is because they have a tendency to think in platform-centric approaches where they invest in small numbers of multiple types of aircraft. So maybe what they need to do is start thinking about how they can have just one or maybe two types of aircraft that do multi-role missions, the sort of thing that Sean was talking about, and really invest in maintaining those capabilities at a high level and thinking in terms of how they can best deter and defend their interests against a rising China. I think that's going to be the challenge for the next 10 years. How do they deal with an assertive and rising China that is intent on imposing its will in the region?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time for the region because, from a trade and economic perspective, the region's very reliant on China. But then, of course, you have this, immense Chinese, buildup with, aircraft, ships, and and so forth. So, yeah, certainly a challenging time for decision makers. Dr. Wood, do you have anything to add to Sean and Malcolm's comments?
Yes, but I have to add that regional countries, when they face about China's challenge. They currently still try to use diplomacy as muscle. So their military preparation compared to China's rising speed or compared to China's action is relatively slow. But of course, in some certain event may accelerate the process. For example, in the May 31st, when the Chinese aircraft, 16 Chinese aircraft approaching to the East Malaysia, and in that month, the next month, Malaysia have the tender. Now they accelerate the procurement of the combat aircraft for the response. But in other cases, usually the speed, and also you can see the Philippines in the after 2012, the Scarborough Shoal incident, they accelerate the procurement. But overall, I think the speed is still relatively slow, and maybe due to their domestic issue, especially the bureaucratic system, and of course the funding issue. And the funding not just about the fund, not just about. The funding is not just about to procure the equipment, also the maintenance. I think that's the reason why the Philippines so far has hesitated to step forward toward the F-16s. And of course, domestically, the infrastructure, especially for the large territory countries like the Indonesia, how they put the sufficient infrastructure to support the deployment, that's not a challenge. Of course, maybe less concern, but still the factor is the integration among itself. Of course, other things like the payment, like what munition, other subsystems will procure, that's also another challenge. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dr. So the three of you presented a very, complicated decision-making process, because you need a very capable platform to deal with these vast geographies, the different types of environments you're going to be encountering, whether it's the ocean, the land, and so forth. Focusing on a single fleet. Ray, you've had a lot of experience, working with these air forces in Southeast Asia. And what would you say would be, the minds, as they're approaching this coming decade, what kind of, mindset do they need to be thinking about as they're approaching, kind of regenerating that air power, creating that air power that they need for the contingencies they might face?
Well, thanks, Greg. Appreciate being a part of this. I just want to echo what Malcolm said, or actually expand on that a little bit. It is a cultural mindset change. I think in the majority of the countries, you have a product mindset. I'm going to go buy an aircraft. And they're doing it because their neighbors are buying aircraft. Instead of starting at the beginning and having their intelligence sections do an appropriate threat analysis of the external and internal threats that their Air Force may have to face, and then having their operators take a look at that threat assessment, take their current capability and apply it to that threat that they're facing, and finding out where their capabilities fall short, whether it's the aircraft or the weapon systems or training or the type of exercises that they're doing, the life cycle maintenance. They need to do a whole operational look at that and then come up with their capability gap analysis, whether it's the platform, weapon system, or whatever area. So they need to move from a product mindset to a solution mindset. To put it in a simple term that my former boss, Admiral Walt Doran, once said, you have to decide, are you going to be an Air Force or are you just a flying club? Because if you believe that you're going to have to fight with that aircraft, that's a different choice than just buying a platform. So you're looking for a solution, not just a product.
So taking a bit more of a holistic approach as just buying something off the shelf because you like an F-16 or whatever aircraft it might be.
Exactly, a solution that's going to close that capability gap and give you a capability to face your external and internal threats.
One factor as well, like dealing with military procurements in the region, we often encounter, it's not always just purely about the specific threats that a country faces. Countries will tend to have very frequently, requiring offsets of the defense contractors to help build that indigenous capability. So they're not even really looking purely at the threats they might face, but rather also very much at the industrial capability. And I was hoping, Sean, what's Boeing, of course, does a lot of aerospace work in the region. And what's Boeing's perspective on, offsets and helping countries build that indigenous capability?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I wouldn't look at them so much as offsets, but opportunities. You know, if you look at the region, it's one of the fastest growing regions in the world when it comes to the aerospace, and in particular the defense aerospace industry. And countries and companies in Southeast Asia offer high quality talent, efficiency, and quality, along with innovation. And so Boeing is attempting to forge partnerships across the region to tap into these pools of expertise to ensure that our products and services deliver the performance our customers are looking for. And so, you know, there's two basic ways that regional industrial partners can participate. One is with content for the platform itself, and then the other, of course, is with the sustainment tail that comes along with it. And so, you know, Boeing has a history of incorporating indigenous or local content per our customers' desires. And then, of course, on the sustainment front, we work hard to leverage the local industrial base, particularly when it comes to maintenance, repair, and overhaul for sustainment services over the life cycle of the platform.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Would anybody else like to touch on the industrial aspect of things, whether they think it's how important that is?
Yeah, look, I'll jump in there. I think there's real potential for Southeast Asian states to think in terms of co-development and co-production of capabilities, particularly if they look past the platforms to think about a system of systems approach. Think about how they can help contribute and cooperate to develop capabilities such as advanced autonomous systems, small satellite capabilities, because let's not forget that increasingly air power operations depend on space power operations. Mm-hmm. And the potential for small satellites and CubeSats that are operating in fractionated constellations to provide sort of ISR capabilities alongside high altitude UAVs are something that countries like Southeast Asian states could do. So that C4 ISR, that battle management, that networking aspect of modern warfare really needs to come to the fore here, rather than just let's go buy a bunch of fighters. And this is something where I think Southeast Asian states should actually sit down together and think, okay, what can we as a group of countries do together to develop common capabilities that can share information and actually contribute to an effect that is greater than the sum of our parts. And I think that's something that maybe needs to come on the agenda.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, as it happens, we just got a question from the audience. And it's kind of an interesting perspective, you know, because in Europe, you've seen certain NATO countries pooling certain assets. I think, you know, AWACS is one asset that's pooled. I think there's a few tanker assets and pooled. And our watcher, Devin, asks, potentially, is there the potential in Southeast Asia for, you know, sort of a teaming arrangement where, you know, air forces share resources? You know, Dr. Wu, would you have any perspectives on that?
Oh, yes. Southeast Asia, between countries, that kind of cooperation so far still relatively low. Of course, cannot compare with the NATO. Back to the Cold War, when that time ASEAN was just the non-communist countryside, that time the cooperation, okay, some kind of proposal was relatively higher, like the joint procurement, but it never comes through. And after Cold War, now the country tend to be more diverse, because now the Southeast Asia definition is a double to the 10 countries. So to carry out this kind of the joint, no matter procurement, planning, cooperation, so far still relatively less. Of course, there is some potential for them for country to do each other, but so we haven't seen the strong trend to happen. On the other hand, is the ASEAN, although this is the most important regional organization, it is very difficult because ASEAN have its own rule. You need all countries' agreement for proceed any cooperation, especially defense. Is relatively sensitive in this region. So there's potentials are there, but the political barrier to overcross the political barrier, that's still challenging. Thank you.
Okay, very good. All right, so then to, I guess, another question we've got, this one I'd like to pose to, you know, Ray. Like, Ray, you've done a lot of work around the merit. You know, one of the themes that always pops up at the Singapore Air Show, and I remember talking to you about this at the last show, 2020, you know, MPA requirements in the region. Can you give us an assessment about how capable the MPA situation is in the region right now, and what do you feel could be improved?
Well, I think Sean touched actually on a lot of the things that can be improved. You need a persistent capability out there. The maritime picture is going to change. And so as they have to take a look at what's the domain that they're going to be operating in, what's the threat or that they're going to be looking at, what kind of targets do they have to track? How long do they have to track those for? What are they going to do with that information? And so there are a few countries that are building up that capability. Some of those countries are with the help of the Maritime Security Initiative. As we talked 2 years ago, my client was the prime sister integrator on the NAVAIR program to put ISR solutions into Royal Malaysian Air Force CN-235s. And so that's going to give the RMAF an excellent capability to do some broad area surveillance, be able to sort their tracks, identify the known and unknown, and then go and investigate the unknown targets. But as you move further east, the Philippines needs to develop that capability. They are starting to take a look at that. Again, Maritime Security Initiative money or 333 FMF funding will come into play. And they're looking at platforms like the C-90, or they recently have expressed an interest in getting some C-12s, EDA from the US government. But those systems are going to have solutions put on board. I don't think they're necessarily going to have the budget to go out and buy a P-8. Sorry, Sean, but I just think that's not going to happen for the Philippines. They're going to have to focus on other types of aircraft, maybe a CN-295 or a CN-235 size of aircraft. And so I think that there's a recognition that the requirement is there. Unfortunately, for the different countries, the path to achieve that capability is different, either and relying in some of the countries on the United States funding to provide that capability.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Anything else to add on the MPA stuff, Sean? Or
the one point that I would make, and several panelists have already made this point, is that a lot of regional countries are able to afford only small fleets of aircraft, and then we talked about the importance of a sustainment package to maintain them over the life cycle of the platform. And, I'd just like to point out that a small fleet of aircraft generally comes with a lack of economies of scale when it comes to sustainment in terms of a global industrial base, training systems, human capital, or the talent to operate and maintain them, as opposed to when buying into a platform like a P-8, you're able to leverage a global industrial base of more than 4,000 737 next generation aircraft that are operating literally around the globe, including in every country throughout the region, coupled with more than 185 P-8s that are on contract as of today. And there's also an element of risk when it comes to transition and sustainment. And if you look at, the platforms that are in demand throughout the region from Boeing, in general, those platforms have already been purchased by the US government as the initial customer. And the US government has bought down the risk of training and sustainment and brings the economies of scale that come with it, that in the end can actually result in lower total ownership costs.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So another question I have for Malcolm as well. Like, this gets back to, we were talking about this online before, fighters. Like, you see the US moving to 5th gen, F-35s and so forth, very advanced versions of the F-15. You've got F-22s, it's really even NGAD coming along stream now. For Southeast Asia, recapitalizing their fighter fleets, should they try to go for that high-end 5th generation capability? What do they do with their fighter fleets to make that work, given the sustainment issues we've been talking about, given the fleet issues we've been talking about?
Look, Singapore obviously is doing that now with the F-35, and I think they're well equipped to do that. So I have no problems with that. The other states, I think, are more challenged to go down the 5th gen, let alone NGAD. it might be better for them to either invest in new capabilities to restore the operational readiness of their existing fighters, or invest in fairly sort of common platforms like the F-16 that can be easily supported by international supply chains, and invest more in the weapons and the systems and the sensors and the networks that can allow those fourth generation or 4+ generation platforms to be most effective. I think also the Southeast Asian states need to think more in terms of how they embrace autonomous systems, rather than trying to go for a small niche sort of boutique force of 5th generation crewed platforms. So there needs to be, I think, a recognition that given the limitations in economics and finances, given the limitations in terms of local industrial capability, a smaller effort on 4th generation systems, but backed up by greater focus on the systems and the networks and the sensors and so forth, is the way to go forward. But ultimately, where the Southeast Asian states can best move forward is with autonomous systems. That's coming along with NGAD, being a system of systems rather than a 6th generation fighter. The potential for Southeast Asian states to jump on board with autonomous systems and be able to contribute not only for their own defense, but also burden share with key allies such as the US, Japan, and Australia, I think is something that really they should take advantage of. And that to me is, if I were a Southeast Asian defense planner sitting in Jakarta or Manila or Hanoi, I'd be thinking, how can we invest in these next generation capabilities rather than investing in 5th generation platforms?
Okay, gotcha. It's really crediting to create that systems of systems approach we read about so much now. Okay. Dr. Wood, do you have anything to add on that point about in terms of, recapitalizing, the fighter capability, if we should put it in quotes now?
I think in South Asia country, the Air Force capability probably can 3 levels. The one level is just for basic the admin demand and the disaster relief, like kind of a very low level combat for the counterinsurgency. And the second one just go to the fighter jet. So and until now, even the 10 countries not all moving to the stage with the fighter jet for the defense. So for the country haven't reached that or barely reached that, for example, Philippines since 2015 finally stepped back to the fight to regain the fighter capabilities. It would be very difficult, very remote for them to jump into something very expensive equipment, especially their current, even you can count the 4th generation, even not 4th generation platform, the number is still very small. So that's difficult for them. Only the country when their 4th generation capability with a certain size, certain capacity, I think that's for them to thinking about jump to the next one. But even the country with certain size, for example, like Thailand, would they really step forward? I think still questionable, especially although they all overall face China's threat, but different countries have a different relation with China. For example, that Thailand is, since they accept China's various infrastructure in the trade, their relation generally fine. They won't feel the desperate. So followed by Singapore and also the Indonesia current KF-21, the project. Another potential would be Vietnam, but Vietnam usually do this procurement also very cautiously. So we don't know how soon they will really stepping into this and or directly go to the more systematic view rather than the platform centric. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Wu. And question for you, Ray, as well. Like, in terms of actual combat aircraft, fighters, the F-16s, F-15s, that kind of thing. There's still a very real kind of counterinsurgency, requirement in Southeast Asia, as we saw with, the battle in Marawi a few years ago. And could you talk to a bit how do you address, you need to deal with this high-end combat capability, but you also still need to deal with that capability where you might have a counterinsurgency situation. I mean, how do Air Forces get that right?
Well, the Philippines Air Force showed that you can take a Vietnam era aircraft like the OV-10 and put a precision guided munition, and this is all open source, so I'm not sharing anything that's new. But they first dropped a GPS guided weapon about 4 or 5 years ago in Abu Sayyaf position using an OV-10 and had incredible precision and lethality because of that. However, the mindset needs to be there that, okay, we need to bring in these weapon systems that give us a greater capability to be more precise, to be more lethal, because especially in these counterinsurgencies, there are political considerations that have to come into play, as Western nations have found throughout the years of dropping ordnance in an urban environment. You have to take into account the civilians that may be there and try to be as accurate as possible, or targets that are on the no hit list, like a hospital or a mosque or a church. And so they, again, changing the mindset as Malcolm addressed, and understanding that it's the holistic approach, the threat equation. You become a threat with the, I call it the threat equation, a platform plus the weapon system, plus your tactics, techniques, and procedures, and your training and how you exercise that aircraft, and developing, establishing your doctrine and developing your CONOPS, and understanding that and doing your planning and saying, what are we going to have to do if we have another, hopefully the Philippine Air Force is taking a look at that 5-month engagement and looking at their lessons learned and saying, okay, we need to build up a stockpile of precision guided munitions. And the other nations in the region taking a look at that nations that might face a counterinsurgency threat. Remember, it was only a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, that Malaysia was engaged in Sabah against an insurgency group, and saying, okay, what kind of CONOPS do we need to have in place? What kind of op plan do we need to have in place? What assets do we have? What assets might we acquire? What capabilities do we have? What might we acquire? And how do we start to build that up to face that internal threat? Stockpiling, the type of training, the networking, as several of my colleagues here have addressed, of how you do that kill chain. How do you go from identifying the target to the weapon on the target, and what's that chain look like? So there's a lot involved there, but they need to start taking a look at it holistically, rather than just saying, I'm going to go out and get this platform. And also saying, in addition, I think I like the way the Royal Malaysian Air Force is looking at it with their CAP 55 program. They realize they have a need for a lighter fighter aircraft. I would say even you could look at a counterinsurgency platform, and the fact that it's going to have to be used in alternate situations where you might need more time on station, or you might have it closer to the suspected area where they might have to operate, and then make sure that you have the weapons on there, and the weapon systems and the CONOPS in place where you can actually execute that mission.
Okay. Greg, if I can just jump in and follow on from what Raymond just said. I think one excellent example that maybe Southeast Asian states need to look at is last year's conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where extensive use of drones and loitering munitions and swarming was so effective against the Armenian forces. Now, admittedly, the focus of that battle was against armored forces and armored fighting vehicles, but the same sorts of capabilities could be applied in a counterinsurgency battle. So I think that Southeast Asian states need to look at that as a case study of where future air power is going in terms of, you know, low cost, quantitative versus qualitative, and combat mass over an adversary. And I think that would be an excellent path for them to take.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to add?
Yeah, the one counterpoint that I would add to this discussion about, you know, low cost drones or unmanned platforms is it works good over relatively short distances when you have line of sight command and control networks. But given the distances in the region, when you start to go over the horizon and those platforms are completely dependent upon those command and control networks, it becomes their Achilles heel, because the loss of the command and control network is essentially mission failure for those platforms.
Okay. So Sean, I've got a question for you as well that came in. I think my internet dropped a second. Can you hear me, Sean?
Yes.
Great. So, countries in Southeast Asia, they're talking about modernizing defense forces. They see it as a national priority. And, core to these plans will be, buying major platforms and equipment. And of course, as we're talking today, of course, it's also looking at that network aspect. But, given the size of the potential investments we're looking at, I mean, what sort of thinking around, the cost benefit would be most helpful as these, governments look at different options, would you say?
Yeah, sure. Of course, considering a platform or a weapon system, there's a capability versus affordability spectrum. And to borrow an analogy from Star Wars, the Death Star had incredible capability, but of course the Empire could only afford one. And so when they lost it, it no longer had military utility. And then of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we've just had a conversation about, low cost attritable drones as an example, where you can afford a large fleet of small swarming drones, but of course they lack some of the attributes that are important for the region, such as range and persistence. And so I think that it's important to consider that affordability trade-off, and not just affordability versus capability at the time of acquisition, but over the total ownership or life cycle of the platform, basically. And so when you look at, some of the Boeing platforms that are relatively large and maybe have a larger acquisition cost, in the end, they result in some lower total ownership cost because of some of the attributes we've talked about, such as leveraging economies of scale across a larger global industrial base, as an example. And so it's a vexing challenge for customers in the region to hit the sweet spot on that capability versus affordability curve. But we've seen some customers, as the panel has already talked about, pursue niche capabilities, and they end up operating mixed fleets of aircraft of relatively small numbers of each aircraft and struggle with sustainment over the life cycle of those platforms, as opposed to investing in a multi-mission platform that then brings economies of scale and sustainment over the entire life cycle of the platform.
Okay. So basically just think about, the long-term investment when you're investing in these things. Okay. So another question's coming. I'd like to pose this one to Malcolm and Dr. Wu. This is a bit of a an ad-week question, but recently, the Sukhoi's unveiled the Su-75, and one of our, online audience has asked, is the Su-75 Checkmate a disruptive fighter aircraft for Southeast Asia? So maybe over to you, Malcolm.
Well, it kind of depends on whether the Su-75 actually does end up flying. What we've seen is essentially a mock-up. Supposedly, Sukhoi are going to build a flying version in the next couple of years, and then they actually have to produce it effectively. And reading up about this platform, it sounds excellent, but the Russians have all sorts of challenges in producing advanced stealth aircraft, which they've found with the Su-57. So the challenge, I think, for the Checkmate is, can it be produced at a cost that is sustainable? Is the performance of the aircraft everything that Sukhoi are promising it will be? And is it affordable, really, when it comes down to it? I think they're talking about $20 to $30 million per aircraft, which, if they achieve that, would be a lot cheaper than even the lowest cost estimates of the F-35. But it's early days yet on the Su-75. I don't see this as a real platform that's actually flying and operationally ready for sales until the end of the decade. The other thing is that it's unlikely that it will be successful in the export market unless the Russian Air Force pick it up as well. And there's no guarantees of that. So it's a chicken and egg scenario. Do the Russians accept it into operational service, or do they want to invest more money on the Su-57? I think it's hard to say. I'm not sort of prepared to bet that the Su-75 Checkmate will really be a success at this point, because it's way too early to say. If it is, and if it's everything they say it will do, and if it's at the cost they'll say it is, then I think it would be potential disruptor for the region, but it's too early to say.
Okay. Dr. Wu?
Oh, yes. Regarding the Russian plan, I think you can see the recent case when this Indonesia purchased Su-35, but the deal eventually was canceled. I think as long as the U.S. sanction or certain kind of the punishment is available, for many South Asian countries, that could be an issue, matter a lot. So that would be one factor to deter them. And another factor to deter will be, for example, like the Myanmar or Vietnam may still choose due to the certain relation with Russia to purchase that. Their current fleet for the fourth generation fighter, you see the Vietnam and their size, Vietnam and Myanmar size, probably around the 30, just 40. Will they willing directly jump to the next generation when their current, the mastering of the current capability, is that really sufficient or not? I think that's another question for them. They really want to walk that fast on that, especially of course that the Malcolm already mentioned, the reliability, the overall, the Su-75, the performance, I think still unknown. So I think this kind of deal won't come very soon.
Okay. Yeah, it's a fascinating aircraft on paper, but I tend to agree it has a long way to go before we really see it showing up at air shows and so forth. But I guess we'll have to wait and see how that develops. Another question I'd like to ask this to Ray and Sean. Maybe Ray first. Ray, you've been involved in a number of campaigns around the region over the years, and you've seen the thinking about platforms. And the one thing that comes up a lot, especially when manufacturers talk about aircraft and systems, is humanitarian disaster relief. And so when air forces are looking at platforms or acquisitions, is that a key priority that when they talk to the manufacturers?
It's not necessarily a key priority, but it's in their thought process. I think both Sean and Malcolm have brought it up that these platforms need to have multiple uses. So for instance, a maritime surveillance aircraft with a synthetic aperture radar and an EOIR system can go out and look for targets, but they can also provide assistance in a post-typhoon disaster relief effort in the Philippines, whether it's trying to look through clouds to see gatherings of people that might need helicopter support, or using EOIR to assess the damage. I think that comes into play, and it needs to be part for my clients, for the OEMs. We need to include that in there because those aircraft are going to have multiple uses. Maybe not so much for the fighter aircraft, but for the transport, helicopter, maritime patrol aircraft. Those uses are going to have to come into play, or the capability to, one of the things that we've looked at is the capability to be able to put a smaller capable radar and EOIR system, a more compact, a swap technology onto an aircraft, in addition with consoles onto a C-90 or a C-12, one of the King Air 350. And then if that aircraft needs to be used to ferry supplies to islands or whether it's COVID relief, then those consoles can come off. You can detach an example would be the NSP-7 synthetic aperture radar, which can just be bolted to the center line, doesn't have to have a dome. Granted, it only gives you a certain angle of coverage, but you can take those off. Now you've got a transport aircraft. So you're getting that dual role. And I know the Philippines has a roll-on, roll-off capability for a C-130, the Sabre system. I don't know much about it, but that capability is there. So it does come into play because those aircraft will be used by the country to provide that support, and it'd be good if it had some capability to provide that kind of support.
Interesting. And Sean?
Yeah, Greg, this goes back to the multi-mission capability, that fourth attribute that I talked about in my opening remarks. And if you look at, Ray's mentioned the value of maritime patrol aircraft through some of the humanitarian disasters that have occurred in the region over the past, say, 20 or 30 years. P-8 brings, we think of it as primarily an anti-submarine warfare platform, but of course its value in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or search and rescue operations has been proven time and again with that sensor suite of multiple sensors to bring to bear to determine, in the case of HADR ops, for example, to find landing zones for helicopters, which takes us to the vertical lift piece of this. You know, the Chinooks and V-22s also have a long history of contributing to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations in the region. And it goes back to the value of procuring a larger platform at the outset that has that multi-mission capability. And we think of that platform in terms of its contribution to high-end military operations. But of course, by investing in a large platform up front, it has tremendous utility on the lower end of the spectrum of military operations down to HADR and search and rescue operations.
Okay, yeah, more like I think the P-8 has a system you can actually drop life rafts from the bomb bay and so forth, so you can do different other missions apart from hunting subs and that kind of thing. That's
exactly right. Proven multiple times during the 10 years of P-8 operations out in the Asia Pacific region.
Okay. Another question for you, Sean. This came in from the audience as well. This is getting back to that offset section. You know, with countries, you know, Indonesia, Malaysia likes to do offsets. What's Boeing's take on the, you know, the IP? Is there ever a concern about, you know, the IP getting away? I mean, how do you control the IP with these arrangements?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, you know, these offsets are essentially opportunities to partner with local industry. And of course, you know, there is an interest in protecting IP to some degree, but on the other hand, we also recognize in order to forge some of these industrial partnerships, we've got to share some of that IP as well. And so, of course, it's a give and take. But in the end, Boeing continues to forge partnerships throughout the region, particularly on the sustainment side.
Okay, very good. Okay, so that's the IP point. Another question, I guess, for, you know, Malcolm and Dr. Wu. Defense procurement's always tricky. You know, buying airplanes has always been hard, even throughout the 2010s when things were going fairly well within the region. And of course, Southeast Asia has been, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's been devastated by COVID-19. I mean, the economies are really taking a hit. There's a major public health crisis. You know, what do you think will be the ramifications of COVID-19 on, you know, defense expenditure? Maybe starting with you, Malcolm.
Look, I think the key challenge that local states will face is twofold. Firstly, as you say, the impact of COVID-19. This pandemic is far from over. Delta is sweeping through the region. There's new variants on the horizon, Mu and Lambda, which could be even worse. Vaccination efforts are way behind. So we are a long, long way from being out of the woods with this pandemic. And as it goes on, the economic damage and the potential for greater economic downturn increases. So states in the region are going to have to factor in the possibility that this could go on for some years and how they maintain the balance between investment in, you know, the non-traditional threat of pandemics versus the traditional threat of military contingencies is going to be the key challenge for them. And for several of the Southeast Asian states, they may not be able to afford a lot of the desired programs that they would like. So, you know, new fighters may just go by the board and they might have to go along with existing platforms and try and modernize those and bring those back into operational services as best they can. And that's where the investment in new weapons, new sensors, better sustainment, better maintenance, better training, all of that really comes to the fore rather than let's go out and buy a few fighters. The other challenge that they have, and this is, you know, looking past the pandemic, is lack of time, because the challenge posed by China is very real. The risk of China moving against Taiwan within this decade is high, and Southeast Asian states can't sit there passively and watch whilst that happens. They have to have an ability to respond and protect their own interests, both in the South China Sea and also in response to any moves by China against Taiwan, because the US won't step back and do nothing if China does make a move against Taiwan. So they have to factor in the possibility that sometime in this decade, there could be a high intensity interstate war between China and the United States over Taiwan. And what does that hold for the region, for Southeast Asian states? How do they respond to that? How do their defense capabilities, as they currently stand and as they're likely to develop in the next few years, how are they well placed to deal with that scenario? So they don't have a lot of time to think, oh, well, nothing bad is going to happen over the next decade, so we can afford to take our time. I think that's the real challenge. It's that lack of resources that are accentuated by the pandemic, and the lack of time to respond for the next major challenge, which I think is the prospect of major power war in the region as a result of a Chinese move against Taiwan.
Okay. And that's certainly the contingency that I think that certainly keeps people up at night. But Dr. Wu, do you have anything to add on Malcolm's remarks about COVID-19 and so forth?
Yes, I agree Malcolm's view. I just want to add one point is Southeast Asia country, due to not very you can say not very integrated. So their location will vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Taiwan may affect their attitude, because some country, for example, Indonesia, relatively further from that, they will face less strategic pressure. Of course, it also depends on some country, for example, like Cambodia, they have a very good relation with China. So okay, it is not their major concern. So those countries with a major concern probably will reflect their location and also their relation with China. And on the other hand is how much they can still maintain the resource investment under the COVID may be also related to their political system, because some country inside the defense usually have a higher priority compared to the others, and in some country the defense more likely be sacrificed. So that's a domestic issue in that situation will matter. Thank you.
Okay, very good, Dr. Wu. And Sean and Ray, you guys are always out there, talking to customers, in the various countries. And have you noticed any a change in like the procurement processes or urgency owing to COVID-19?
I have recently contacted by our friends in Malaysia and Indonesia, primarily with illegal immigration in certain areas where the maritime lines of communication are being used to bypass any attempt to keep people out, or at least keep them who might be coming in that are spreading COVID. So there's some interest in those areas in a maritime surveillance capability in a broad area sense.
Okay.
And so certainly economic recovery from COVID is, putting downward pressure on defense spending. But the panel has outlined the security challenges that countries in the region face. And so while there certainly is going to be some near-term impact, if you look over the longer term, we believe that military expenditures throughout the region will continue to increase in the fashion that they have over the past decade.
Okay, very good. Well, gentlemen, we're coming to the end of the panel. Just a few more minutes left, and I guess it's time for closing remarks. And I'd like to just go to each one of you individually and ask you, what do you see as the maybe defining air power technology in the coming decade? If you could just give us a few lines as hypersonics, UAVs, whatever you think it might be. Maybe starting with you, Sean?
Yeah, great, Greg. I wouldn't call this necessarily the defining one, but it's certainly going to be a game changer. And this is manned-unmanned teaming. In my earlier remarks, I spoke somewhat bearishly about the prospects or the utility of unmanned platforms, in that their Achilles heel is maintaining that command and control link back to some human in or on the loop. The advantage of manned-unmanned teaming is that unmanned platform, it now goes into the battle space alongside or in proximity to that human operator, which reduces the vulnerability of those command and control networks. And so if you look at what Boeing is doing with Loyal Wingman as an example, I think manned-unmanned teaming has tremendous utility going forward.
Okay, brilliant. So you'd have a man on a sort of pilot on nearby, like on the loop, if you will, managing things.
Reducing the dependence on over-the-horizon command and control networks.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Malcolm, defining technologies.
I'll echo Sean. I'll be politically correct and call it crude autonomous teaming. But I think that is the key. It's autonomous systems, the ability to introduce mass back into the equation rather than have small niche forces from an Australian perspective, that's what we need to do. We've got small boutique forces of F-35s and Super Hornets and so forth. We're trying to find a way to not only reach out and strike at longer range, but also have greater combat weight. And the way to do that is through autonomous systems and through crewed autonomous teaming. And what NGAD potentially offers out there at the end of the decade, I think, is that sort of approach of a network that comprises autonomous and crewed platforms working together, integrated with space capabilities and near space capabilities, exploiting electronic and cyber attack. And obviously, all of these come together to transform how we approach air power. I'll add in one other aspect. Our acquisition cycles are way too long. 20 plus years for the F-35. That's way too long. So we do need to accelerate that. And the sort of digital century series approach of e-design and synthetic development, I think, is the way to go. If we can actually start getting ahead in an innovation cycle, we're producing smaller numbers of platforms, but each time we produce a new generation, they're getting better and better. That's the way to essentially maintain a military technological advantage against a rising China. And we have to do that. If we go down the path of 20-year acquisition cycles, we're lost. So that's something that maybe Southeast Asian states need to consider, is how do they exploit e-design and synthetic development?
Okay. Dr. Wu.
Somehow similar to our other panelists' view, but I think it will be more about the surveillance. No matter they use a UAV, no matter they use a satellite, I think Southeast Asian country, okay, except from Singapore and perhaps Brunei, due to the size, they don't need to concern surveillance as a serious challenge. But for other countries in a large territory, surveillance is always difficult. So no matter which platform or which kind of method can provide the surveillance, I think they will be the main challenge for them to overcome in the next decade. Thank you.
All right, so basically, high quality surveillance. And finally, to you, Ray, you've been defense for quite a while. You missed it. What's next 10 years? Key things.
I agree with all these guys. No, I do. I mean, they've really touched on a lot of different subjects, and I think from my perspective, what I'm seeing, which is encouraging, is a focus on information flow. How to get the information back to where the decision makers are so that you can make, and how to process that information and then get it back out to the operator that needs to put into action the decision. And I'm seeing a better focus on that. And so I think that we'll see that, whether it's the gathering of the information, the transmitting of it, the processing of it, the sending it back out, it's that information flow that is getting the focus, and I think will get the focus in the next 3 to 5 years from a lot of the different customer sets that are out there. That is happening right now and will continue to happen.
Yeah, it's going to be key. Getting the information around, getting it to the right people is essential. That's what it's really all about nowadays. Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Well, that unfortunately brings us to the end of what has been a very fascinating discussion. I would like to thank each of our panelists for giving so generously of their time and expertise today. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Boeing, for helping to make today's webinar successful, as well as our partner for this series, the Singapore Air Show. And thank you, of course, to the audience for joining us and asking such thought-provoking questions. I'm sorry we were only able to cover a small proportion of them. Please keep an eye on FlightGlobal.com, where we will be publishing details of upcoming webinars. We would love to have you join us again. And until then, from the FlightGlobal team, goodbye. And we hope to see you at the Singapore Air Show in February. Thank you.